Welcome to LV Scary Stories, where chilling tales come to life. In this video, we're diving into 4 spine-tingling stories that blur the line between life and death. From a nurse's eerie experiences with patients on the brink of passing, to a grandmother's final moments, revealing a shocking connection. These stories will leave you questioning what happens when the veil between worlds begins to lift. So, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into the supernatural. You won't want to miss these haunting tales of love, loss, and the unexplainable. Let's begin. Story number 1. I'm a nurse. I work with a lot of patients who are dying. Many of them mention seeing their deceased husbands or wives at their side. Their hallucinations can be unsettling sometimes. But I didn't think much of it. It's just part of the dying process, I guess. I remember when my grandma was very sick and on life support for 4 weeks. Every time the doctors thought she was improving and took her off life support, they had to put her back on. One day, some relatives and I were at her bedside. I overheard the elders asking my grandma if she wanted the doctors to keep putting the tube down her throat. She shook her head. No. Since she couldn't speak with the tube in her mouth, she would nod or shake her head to communicate. Finally, one of my aunts asked her if she wanted the doctors to remove the tube and let her go. My grandma nodded, yes. After the family held a brief meeting, they decided to honor her wishes and inform the doctors. Since most of the immediate family was already present, they gave their consent for the nurses and doctors to remove the tube. After the tube was removed, my grandma couldn't breathe on her own. The nurse gave her medication to ease her suffering. We started calling our younger cousins, urging them to come see grandma if they were off work because she might not make it through the night. We watched as her breathing became rapid, then paused, then rapid again. The nurse explained to my family that this was typical before someone passes away. Right before her heart stopped, something strange happened. She suddenly woke up and began talking to family members who had been dead for years. She even mentioned my grandpa by name. When Grandma started talking to these deceased relatives, some of the family left the room and waited in the hall, too unsettled to stay. Then Grandma looked up as though someone had just arrived. Despite struggling to breathe, she said, "Oh, you're finally here, Chia." My dad gently told her that she was very tired and urged her to rest and stop talking so much because it was making it harder for her to breathe. Grandma closed her eyes and stopped speaking. A few minutes later, she passed away. We stayed by her side, waiting for more relatives to come. All of the younger cousins arrived except for Chia. Chia was Grandma's favorite granddaughter. When we texted her earlier, she said she was on her way, but it was strange that she still hadn't arrived. Everyone tried calling her, but she didn't answer. Later, we found out that Chia had died in a car crash on her way to see Grandma. She had just broken up with her boyfriend, and she was drinking and driving. Story number 2. My wife and I bought a new house back in 2002 when we had our first son, Sai. It was a brand new house, and my family and I were the first ones to live there. In fact, we still live in the same house to this day. We moved into the house shortly before the birth of Sai. 2 years later, my wife and I had a daughter named Sunny. When Sai was 4 years old, he started telling my wife and me that he saw a little boy ghost in our house. However, Sai didn't seem scared or upset. He would tell us that the ghost boy was very sad and cried a lot. Since we were the first family to live in the house, we didn't believe it could be haunted. My wife and I assumed the ghost boy was just a figment of Sai's imagination. One day while my wife was at work, I was home with Sai and Sunny. Sai came to me and said that the ghost boy was in his room crying. I decided to play along and asked, "Oh, what's the ghost boy's name?" Sai replied, "His name is Tony." I then asked, "Why is Tony crying?" Sai said, Tony's father died in a car crash coming back from Las Vegas. Curious, I asked, "How old is your friend Tony?" "He's 5 years old, Daddy," Sai said. To humor him, I gave Sai 2 pieces of candies and told him to give one to Tony to cheer him up. Sai happily took the candies and ran back to his room. 2 years later, my wife got pregnant again, this time with another boy. By then, Sai no longer talked about Tony. He had outgrown that stage of having imaginary friends, so we thought nothing of it. When my wife was 8 months pregnant, we still hadn't found a name for our baby. We wanted an American name. I jokingly suggested naming our baby after our doctor, Robert, who would deliver him. My wife shook her head and said she didn't like the name. She had a point. Naming an Asian boy Robert didn't feel quite right, LOL. One day my parents were hosting an annual cultural ceremony, so I took my family out of town to attend. Unexpectedly, my wife's water broke during the event, and we had to rush her to a hospital in that city. The doctor who delivered our baby wasn't Robert. His name was Anthony. We decided to name our son Anthony after him. As Anthony grew up, we called him by his full name. However, my brother's kids started calling him Tony, as it's a common nickname for Anthony. One day, my 2 older brothers asked if I wanted to join them on a trip to Las Vegas. They were planning to drive to Irvine and then head to Vegas with some relatives. At first, I agreed to go so I could help with the driving, since it's a long road trip. At that time, my son Anthony was already 5 years old. Later that night, I started thinking about what Sai had said years ago about his imaginary friend Tony. Tony had said his father died in a car crash coming back from Las Vegas. It struck me. Anthony and Tony were the same name. What if Sai hadn't seen a ghost, but had somehow seen the future? The more I thought about it, the more I leaned toward not going. The next day I told my brothers that I couldn't go because my wife wasn't feeling well. That weekend, my brothers went to Las Vegas without me. On their way back, nothing happened during the drive from Vegas to Irvine, but as they were heading home from Irvine, my eldest brother, who was driving, got sleepy. The car shook, waking both of my brothers. They realized they were veering dangerously close to a truck. My brother swerved to avoid going under the truck, but the truck hit their car. The back seat and part of the trunk were crushed. My brothers were incredibly lucky to have been sitting in the front seats. They managed to escape with minor injuries. If I had gone with them, I would have been in the back seat. I would have died. Even my brothers said it was fortunate that I hadn't joined them. The year after the accident, I started getting really sick. I lost a lot of weight and frequently called out of work. My wife and I consulted a shaman who performed a ritual and told us that my life energy had been depleted. The shaman replenished my energy and assured us that I would be okay. Still, I sometimes wonder if I was destined to die in that car crash. Was I supposed to die that day, but something changed my fate? Even after the shaman's intervention, I occasionally feel deep sadness for no reason. Sometimes I feel a pull toward suicide, despite having no reason to feel that way. My wife and I have a good life. Our house is paid off, our cars are paid off, and we have no financial worries. Yet, this inexplicable sadness lingers. Now, about my son Anthony. Remember how Sai said years ago that he saw a ghost boy named Tony? I wonder, what if Tony wasn't a ghost? What if Sai somehow saw the future instead? Maybe in another timeline I was already dead. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be alive today, but I am. Story number 3. My wife and I got married later in life. I was 34 and she was 32. We chose to marry late because we wanted to live like birds. Birds build their nests before bringing their young into the world. I've never understood why some people bring children into the world only to watch them struggle in poor situations. Both my wife and I are successful and have good jobs. We bought a nice new house, and finally she became pregnant with our first child. A year later, she gave birth to our baby boy, Sunan. When Sunan was 4 years old, he would often take my PlayStation 2 memory cards and hide them. For those who don't know, PS2 memory cards are essential for saving your progress in games. Without them, you can't play. I'd come home from work at 10 p.m., shower, eat, and then unwind by playing some games before bed. One night I couldn't find my memory cards. I knew Sunan probably took them to play with, so I searched everywhere. In his toy box, under the couch, and around the house, but I couldn't find them. Frustrated, I gave up and went to bed. The next morning, my wife went to work, and since I didn't start work until 2 p.m., I got Sunan up for breakfast. As he climbed out of bed, he reached under his pillow and pulled out my 2 memory cards, handing them to me. I asked him why he put them under his pillow. He looked at me and said, "Because you keep staying up late." He was only 4 years old, but his words and behavior felt so strange. Years passed, and when Sunan was in 7th grade, something happened that made me think about my late father. One day during PE class, they had an obstacle course where students had to run, jump, and climb. When Sunan climbed a wooden wall and dropped down the other side, the head of a nail sticking out slightly scratched his chest. He was sent to the nurse's office, and while the scratch healed, it left a long, thin scar across his chest. When I saw that scar, I couldn't help but think about my father. My father had passed away many years ago, but he used to do something similar to Sunan. When I was a kid, my father would take the wires from my Super Nintendo and put them under his pillow at night because he didn't want us staying up late. My father had a difficult life. He was an orphan who struggled greatly, even digging through trash to find food as a child. Despite these challenges, he worked incredibly hard after coming to America and became successful, allowing our family to move to a different city away from our relatives. Unfortunately, some relatives misunderstood this and accused him of being arrogant and greedy. When my father passed away from cancer, we held a 3-day funeral for him. During the ceremony, one of the elder clansmen, a grandpa who had helped my father marry my mother, did something shocking. He was upset that my father had chosen to live away from the clan. In his anger, the grandpa took a knife, sliced open my father's shirt, and cut into his chest. The knife left a long scratch-like wound. The relatives scolded the grandpa, asking why he would do such a thing. The grandpa replied, "You don't understand. I cut his chest so that in the next life, he'll be born with a better heart, a heart that yearns for his relatives." On the 3rd day of the funeral, an aunt who came from out of state arrived. Crying, she touched my father's forehead and said, "In your next life, may you choose good parents, so you won't have to be an orphan, so you won't have to suffer so much." Looking back, I can't help but feel that Sunan is the reincarnation of my father. If he is, he did choose wisely in this life. My wife and I are doing well and have a good life. We waited until we were stable before having him, and I promised to do everything in my power to take care of him, my wife, and myself, so that he'll never face the hardships my father endured. Story number 4. All I remember is that I grew up not knowing who my father was. My mother would take me to the playground or the park, and while I was playing, she and her boyfriend would just make out. Other parents would pull their kids away from me. Nobody ever taught me how to be a proper man or how to stand on my own 2 feet. Growing up was strange. I watched my mother go through boyfriend after boyfriend while leaving me with my grandma most of the time. I don't know what it feels like to have a real mom and dad. Here I am now, 24 years old, lying in a hospital bed. My hands are tied to the bed because the doctors don't want me to pull out the wire running into my heart. The doctor told me that without it, I will die. The wire is helping my heart, and he's hoping that since I'm young, my heart will heal on its own. I can hear two nurses standing outside my room talking. One of them says, "Wow, the guy in there is only 24 years old." The other nurse replies, "Yeah, but he's a drug addict." Hearing what the nurses said made me feel less than human. I don't know how much medication they've given me, but I feel so weak and sleepy all the time. That day a man came to see me. I had never seen this man in my life. However, the moment he walked into my room, I knew it was my father, the man I had always wished I knew, the man who was never there for me. My hands were still tied to the bed. I wished the nurses would come and untie my wrists. I wanted to get up and punch this man in the face for leaving me to struggle through life with my mother. The man just sat on the side of my bed and looked at me. I could see tears in his eyes. He turned towards the wall and began to weep. Then he turned back, looked at me, and said, "I was supposed to go a long time ago, but I couldn't. You are my blood. I've always been with you, seeing everything you've done in your life. I'm sorry. As a father, I made poor choices. My bad fate has been passed on to you. Before my time in this world ends, I want to see my son become a man. My bad fate should end with me. When I go, I will take my bad fate with me. Be a good man so that one day you won't have to see your son the way I see you now. I love you, son." I woke up from that dream to bright lights and voices around me. I saw doctors and nurses, and one nurse said, "The patient is awake, doc." I heard the doctor say, "Give him more medication to knock him out." I didn't know it at the time, but they were taking me into surgery to fix my heart. 2 days later, a nurse woke me up. I thought I was dead, but I was still alive. The nurse explained that they had tied me to the bed to stop me from pulling out the wire in my heart and the tube in my mouth. However, I managed to loosen the straps and pull the wire out, which is why they had to take me into surgery. Later that day, the nurse called my wife to tell her I was awake. She brought our 2 sons to see me. My wife and I had divorced the previous month because of my drug addiction, but I was so happy to see her and our boys. When my wife saw me and the large incision on my chest, she held my hand and cried. I begged her, telling her I wanted us to be a family again. I promised to get help and quit my drug addiction. My wife said we'd talk about it once I was out of the hospital. After I was discharged, my wife and I remarried. I went to rehab and managed to quit my addiction. Later that year, I asked my mother about my father. She told me he had been a drug addict too, and had died shortly after they divorced from a drug overdose. Wherever my father is now, I hope he has found peace. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.